If I was to ask you, in the most simple terms, what the ideal society looks like, would you think that I'm insane? Or would you actually give it a go? Would you entertain the possibility that yes, the ideal society is possible, that yes, we can get there, and that yes, with our theme, crafting our future, that we should at least think about it, even if it isn't? Because when I first saw the theme, crafting our future, it was quite a daunting prospect. As we can all agree, crafting the present was hard enough, and looking around at everything around us, at the seats you're sat on, at the auditorium that you're sat in, the cars outside, everything about society makes no sense. It makes no sense because there are so many imaginations, so many incredible people, it honestly beggars belief. But when you get past that, and when you start thinking about where we're going next, you have to find some kind of measure. How do you measure the ideal society? Now, it may sound impossible, and is, in fact, is impossible, but I did try, and with a quick Google search and the Ipsos World Questionnaire, we have what makes the people happiest, globally, of course. Any of you that can't read, that's physical health and well-being, my children, my relationship with my partner's spouse, feeling that my life has meaning. Broadly, we're breaking this into categories. We've got my health, we've got self-worth, we've got friends, we've got family. That's what this really all boils down to. So what's the fabric between all of those things? Because they all make us happy. We want a society where everyone is happy, because the ideal society must be better than the one that we're in right now. Otherwise, why would we leave? So, how does it all gel? How did we get here? Why is this the way it is? The answer, philosophically, is a social contract theory. How many of you are aware that when you were born, you signed a contract? This is a contract you cannot leave. This is a contract that you signed. This is a contract that means that you follow the rules. You follow the law. You do exactly as you're told. And that to do this, you get the perfect compromise. Starting, of course, as we always do with the people, think back to a time in which we are cavemen. We are living in the most autonomous, free, and liberal society that has ever existed in the history of humankind. Perfect, right? So, thinking back to the people, a problem arises. You have a neighbor. Your neighbor is very lovely until they steal your cow. Your neighbor has annoyed you, and hence you kill thy neighbor. An issue is, though, is that your neighbor might be useful later, and then you can't get your neighbor back. So then you think, well, I probably shouldn't kill people, should I? And also, it's just not a very nice thing to do. So, everyone begins to agree that, yeah, you probably shouldn't kill people, and then you have your first law. Everyone's agreed on this. It's a good law. It makes sense. We keep going. We keep having laws. We keep going. We keep going. We keep going. We keep going. We have a system in place. How do we enforce the system? The governing body. We create power. We give a certain individual a sovereign, whether they be king, whether it be a group of individuals, they have slightly more power than everyone else because they get to tell everyone else what to do. They make sure that everyone follows the rules. They make sure that everything stays as it should be. This is all perfect. This is all exactly as it should be. And this is exactly how power works. Because I wonder how many of you can tell the fact that this is literally everywhere, every corner of the globe, the social contract. However, we're talking about an ideal society here, and as I think we can agree, this may not be an ideal society. Something's clearly missing. Hence, we move on to where we all started, and Thomas Hobbes. In the image behind me, you may recognize this as the state of nature. Thomas Hobbes was famous as a philosopher because he believed that this is where we started. He described it as a short life, as nasty, brutish. It's not a good existence. He described it as such and said that the social contract was a compromise. It was lifting us up out of squalor, and that this is where we want to be. And in many ways, he's completely correct. But differing philosophers may add that, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that actually, given the problems of what we've got, the state of nature does not look like that. The state of nature instead looks much, much nicer. It looks a bit like this. Now, any of you that know Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was writing during the French Revolution, wasn't a big fan of governing bodies, considering that the social contract had utterly failed. So, he was thinking how we needed to get ourselves out of this situation. Instead of the state of nature being a constant state of war, he recognized that humans aren't actually awful people, that naturally we have a sort of kindness. John Locke described this as a kind of natural law, that we must be nice to one another in God's image, but that the issue is that once you declare war on someone else, they declare war on you, and it never, never, never ends. This is instead where we started. The social contract instead of being a compromise, is then an antidote to the plague of humanity. Because overpopulation, he said the invention of leisure, not sure whether I agree, greed, pride, envy, this is all leading us into bad places. The creation of private property, and then suddenly you covet thy neighbour's much nicer house and there's nothing you can do about it, because thy neighbour is part of the governing body. See, we started all this with the idea of rational self-interest. This is how we get to our best society. But somehow no one thought that with rational self-interest, it would stop being rational, and that some people would go, yes, I want more. So instead, he described this as the naturalized social contract. This is the failure. This is what perhaps many of you can recognize in many societies nowadays. He goes on to the normative social contract. The normative social contract is a really interesting idea. It's a form of direct democracy. We've got the people living about their day, we've got the governing body, the social contract remains intact, but then we have the people come together in a referendum style, and they vote. Everyone votes, and with complete near unanimity, because remember, justice has to be decided unanimously, it has to all be equal, they vote together, and hence, we've got a perfect social contract. Except we don't. Because not everyone agrees. Not sure, yeah. We've got black sheep all the time. There will always be one who disagrees, and that is a good thing. We have to have disagreement. Otherwise, we are presented with the tyranny of the majority. Of course, you've got to be practical here. Not everyone can get their way. You've got to have a majority. But then what happens when the majority completely outweigh a rather sizable minority? We see this everywhere in history. The tyranny of the majority is not a good thing. It's a terrible thing. It's caused many suffering in the history of the human race. And this is what arises out of human nature. So the normative social contract doesn't seem very realistic. If you look at America and its federal system, it would not cut the test. So, we've now got to come up to a kind of modern solution. We've got to come up with a way of creating our ideal society. Is it still possible? Debatable. Our last philosopher, John Rawls, in The Theory of Justice, published in 1972, if any of you are interested in reading it, he came up with two principles. Number one, the society must be basic liberties for everyone. This means that you may have the same liberties, but you cannot have liberties which would encroach on someone else's. Number two, that it's okay for one person to have more wealth than another out of their own self-worth, as long as the person who's the least disadvantaged is still being carried by the wave of progress. It's all sounding very good, until we reach the first principle. We go back to it, basic liberties. Once again, it doesn't make sense. Not everyone agrees. This sense of justice is impossible. So despite this being the most modern philosopher, he still falls victim to the trap of every other. The social contract sounds great, but the social contract fails at every turn because of humans, because we're selfish. So what have I just spent the last 10 minutes talking about? Is there actually a point to the ideal society, to the crafted future that I wanted to create? Because now it seems like there isn't any point at all. So before I go, I want to leave you with a very interesting scenario. Imagine, this is called the veil of ignorance. Imagine that you are just a brain. There is nothing but you. You have no idea of your gender, of your sex, of your ethnicity. You have no prior knowledge of anything that may distinguish you from any other human being. Now, this is where we get the perfection of justice. Because if you decide, oh, I'm going to create a law that disadvantages people with curly hair, what if you have curly hair? You're doomed. That is the only way, believe it or not, that we've come up of how to create the perfect justice. The perfect justice for the perfect social contract, for the perfect ideal society, philosophically speaking. So then what? This is clearly impractical. This clearly isn't going to happen. So what do I leave you with? I leave you with that this all began with rational self-interest. But the dichotomy here is that though rational self-interest may be natural, naturally, rational self-interest cannot be equal. It cannot. But that doesn't mean that we need to try a bit harder. And by a bit, I mean a lot. I want the future to look better than it does right now. I don't know about the rest of you, but there always is something, individually, whatever it may be, that you want to change. Because change is the only way that we keep going, and it's the only way we reach our ideal society. This social contract may prove that humans do find it rather tricky to get along. It still doesn't mean that the ideal society can't exist. It may not be a utopia. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for it. And though I may have wasted your time, I hope that you got something interesting out of this. Thanks.